Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time I want to talk about the quality issue we are seeing with the Game Freak Pokemon games and how it can be fixed. So what I'm referring to here isn't necessarily just Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, it's an issue we've seen sort of progress over the generations, but Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is a great example of it. Now disclaimer, I don't want to be one of those people that's completely ragging on the Pokemon game, that's always attacking them, critiquing them, but I'm also going to be frank. There are issues and they need to be addressed. I enjoy the games, I've been buying almost every single one every time they come out. I love Pokemon, I'm a big fan, and I hope they continue to release them on a pretty consistent basis, but I think there's more that can be done here. There are problems, and I don't think Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are a proper representation of the Nintendo brand. And when I say Nintendo brand, I'm referring to quality, polish. Nintendo games oftentimes take longer than we want for them to come out, but when they do come out, usually, they're pretty well optimized and polished. They do what they're meant to do, and there are minimal issues, there are minimal bugs. The same can't be said for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. So we're going to be talking about this issue, how it can be fixed, how it can be addressed today. Before we jump into things, let me first very briefly mention my social media. You may see a few different things here on the screen. You can check that all out. It's linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe or perhaps consider joining as a member. So with Scarlet and Violet, I feel the issues have come to sort of a boiling point here, because these games are huge. They are the first true open world Pokemon games, and as a result, a lot of people are excited for these games. A lot of people have been buying them. In the first 3 days, over 10 million have been sold, and that's unprecedented. That is the best numbers we've seen in the first 3 days for any single exclusive for any video game system in the history of the games industry. So it's incredibly impressive. And the gameplay is there. There's quality in these games, but it really feels like they needed more time. In my personal experience of the game, I have seen a number of weird issues. I've seen definitely a poor frame rate where the game sometimes halts very briefly. There's a stuttering, there's an inconsistency there. From a visuals perspective, the game a lot of times actually looks really good, but then other times is kind of plain or blurry. But the bigger issues lie in some of the glitches we're seeing. Several times when I've done battles, I've seen sections where you can literally see under the map and it just looks weird and off and it takes away from your immersion. I've seen a moment where the textures of my starter Pokemon at the time, Florigato, were warped. They weren't what they were supposed to be. And at first I thought it was kind of cool because I thought the Pokemon was dirty, but I was in a water environment and it couldn't clean itself. I had to sort of completely leave the environment for its textures to be reset. There was just something that was off about that. And then another time I was in one of the towers where you can find the Gimmighoul chest. And at the time, I'd already done this a couple times in different towers, and there were no issues, but this third time that I had done it, I interacted with the chest, and it started a battle, and normally when you start a battle, you're supposed to jump back, you throw out your Pokemon, and a appropriate battle stage is set, so it looks fine, but this time my avatar did not jump back. It stayed stuck in front of the Gimmighoul, so during the course of that battle, my Pokemon was literally attacking through my own body to attack the Gimmighoul, which was weird and off-putting and definitely taking away from my immersion of the game. It was distracting. And then recently we actually learned that there's this issue where the OHKO moves that can completely take out a Pokemon in one single hit, but are balanced out by only being 30% accurate, can be made to be 100% accurate by taking advantage of the RNG system in the game, which clearly has not been done appropriately because this is not supposed to happen. This would sort of break the game from a competitive side of things. And what ensures us that it's something that's definitely not supposed to work that way is that this RNG issue only works in Battle Stadium and not in other parts of the game where you battle. So there's definitely issues here. It's very clear that this game was rushed. And that's what's really concerning to me. Because when we look back to when Scarlet and Violet were announced, or right before when they were going to be announced, I remember making a prediction that we wouldn't be seeing this generation this year. And I guess you could argue that was a little bold, but other people felt similar to myself, Because Pokemon's been coming out with the new generations of games every 3 years consistently. They've been coming out every November the last decade or so. It's been pretty consistent. But I was anticipating that they would finally push things off a bit. Because we had just gotten Legends Arceus in January, and also Pokemon Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl in November. Yet, in February, when that Pokemon Presents came, as they pretty much tend to do every February, they went ahead and announced Scarlet and Violet. Instead of announcing maybe a paid DLC for Legends Arceus to kind of extend the gameplay for that for this year and tie things over until next year, they just gave us a little bit of a free DLC update and moved straight on to marketing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the next generation of Pokemon. I wasn't even expecting them to wait all the way until holiday 2023. I was just thinking maybe they would save it for the end of the fiscal year, which would have been March of 2023, and that would have given Game Freak about 3 months or so more time to test out bugs, optimize things, and make it a little bit of a cleaner experience that isn't seeing issues like the ones I've described. The game wouldn't have been perfect, but it would have been more polished, something that would have been acceptable for a lot more people, and probably a better representation of what a Nintendo game should be. Again, this may sound like I'm completely ranking on Scarlet and Violet here, but these are things that are factually occurring, and the games are still good, do not get me wrong, but there is a controversy here. There is issues that need to be addressed. So why is this happening? Well, let's take a look at the timeline of mainline Pokemon games that have been coming out. I'm taking this straight from the wiki page here, but these dates are accurate. These are when the versions had their original releases, and when you take a look at the beginning generations versus the late generations, you're going to notice something interesting. The games are more spaced out early on, but in recent times we've been getting games on an annual basis, if not more so when you take a look at 2022, how we got both Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet. And what's sort of mind-boggling about this is that Legends Arceus, from many perspectives, is one of the most ambitious Pokemon games ever made, and then they follow that up 10 months later with an even more ambitious Pokemon game. I'm all for the ambition. I love the direction that the series is headed in from a gameplay perspective. I love that they're focusing more on exploration and how you interact with the Pokemon. This is all amazing. But with Scarlet and Violet, as I said earlier, I feel like we're reaching a boiling point because coming up with games so consistently is leading to problems. Let's go back to Sword and Shield. With Sword and Shield, there was this huge controversy about the national decks and how not every single Pokemon would be in the games. I know a lot of people care about this very much, so I'm not judging you for this, but personally, I didn't think it was that big of a problem because I thought, okay, well, if you're going to be coming out with games so consistently, something has to give. Every generation there are more and more Pokemon. They are even harder and harder to optimize for and balance out and render all sorts of new animations and things of that nature. So spreading things out, I think, makes sense. Over the course of a generation, there will be DLC and other versions like a BDSP or Legends Arceus, where we'll still see most of the Pokemon anyway. So I was fine with this, because ultimately I thought it would mean a greater focus on quality. Yet here with the next generation, what I thought would be a more polished game, because typically the second generation per system from Pokemon is a game where the visuals take a significant leap, where there's more done, there's more mechanics, and there's an overall greater sense of polish. And there is more ambition. There is definitely a bigger idea here that I think they're trying to accomplish with Scarlet and Violet, and it's definitely a step in the right direction from a gameplay perspective. But from a polish perspective, well, it's just not there. So I feel the issue has been established. There are too many mainline games coming out too frequently with minimal time in between. Yes, they're selling really well, they're making tons of money, but the quality is starting to show deterioration. How can this be fixed? Some people might suggest, well, just throw money at the problem, hire more people, make a bigger team. Pokemon Company is a huge company, they should just double or triple the size of Game Freak. And to some extent, I understand that, but there is a limit here. Because you have to understand that when a team is working on a game, there needs to be a cohesive collective vision on the work. When you start to make the team bigger and bigger and bigger, it becomes increasingly more difficult to complete a game with a nice, clean, cohesive vision. Just throwing more money at the issue doesn't necessarily solve the problem. When Sword and Shield came out, and then the following year they had the DLC, I was very excited about this because DLC, you're just basically working on the game that already exists, building off what's already there. It's easier to make content for that. It saves you time and resources. Saving time and resources is a really good thing for Game Freak because they have a really high stress load right now because they're expected to come out with a game every single year. So having an in-between where there's DLC that isn't as hard definitely was a win. And then the following year, when there were the rumors of a remake of Diamond and Pearl, which we eventually found out would be Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, I was excited about that too because a remake isn't as hard to make. And when they announced it and it turned out that they were outsourcing that, I was even more excited about that because that meant, okay, they are outsourcing this. Game Freak itself isn't even developing this, so that makes it easier for them to work on something else. And we were getting Legends Arceus instead, and that was coming out a little bit later, into January, so they were given an extra couple months to have something ready that would be amazing. And Legends Arceus, for many people, is one of, if not the best Pokemon games ever made. And that was made by Game Freak. So when given enough time, Game Freak can make a really quality title. But then they were expected to follow this up 10 months later with an even bigger game with Scarlet and Violet. Why is this happening? Ultimately, I think it comes down to Pokemon Company, not Game Freak, expecting a new generation every 3 years. Creatures Inc. works on the Pokemon models and updates those, Game Freak makes the games, but you also have the anime, you have the trading cards, you have a whole slew of merchandising and movies. There's a lot more to Pokemon than just the games, even though the games are the source material. The problem with being the source material is that they need these things to come out with consistency so they can move on with everything else, where most of the money comes from. So there is a pressure to come out with these games consistently and frequently. But when we look back to the past, where, yeah, they still came out with generations pretty much every 3 years. There's a couple times where it's every 4 years when we take a look at generations 4 and 5, but for the most part, it was about every 3 years. They just didn't have to make a whole bunch of other stuff in between. And yet now we're getting a whole bunch of stuff in between where we're seeing basically something annual from Game Freak every time. So is the fix just to not have these in-between games? Maybe they could just do less, but I don't see how Pokemon Company would be okay with that because that would literally mean less money. They're coming out with games every year, sometimes even more often than that, and they're still selling a ridiculous numbers. Legends Arceus is well over 10 million last I checked, Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl well over 10 million, Scarlet and Violet in 3 days well over 10 million. These games are selling like hotcakes and they are releasing them with frequency. Like, the frequency of release does not seem to decrease the amount of sales here, which is insane. So, if anything, Pokemon Company is being incentivized to come out with more Pokemon games because the more they release, the more money they make. So they're not going to just start spacing things out just for quality reasons unless all of a sudden this quality issue leads to less money made. And with the success of Scarlet and Violet right now, well, even though there is clearly a quality issue, the game's still selling incredibly well. So I am curious to see how the sales will continue after the first 3 days, but odds are this game is going to continue to sell really well, and it may even go down as the best-selling Pokemon game ever, because it's already trending in that direction. My opinion, what should be done is that they start to lengthen the generations. Instead of it being every 3 years, do 4 years. There was a time where they did 4 years, and it was fine. And this doesn't have to mean that there isn't still some sort of annual release. Have DLC. If another Legends game comes out, have DLC for that. Sure, continue to outsource remakes, even though those remakes may not be as good. If it means that we're getting games like the Legend series and actual polished open world versions of the mainline games with quality DLC, that's fine too. Maybe if things are spaced out a little bit more when we do get these remakes and they are outsourced, even that developer is given a little bit more time to do a better job of it. So maybe even the remakes can have a better quality than what we saw from Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. Now the issue with spacing things out could come down to the merchandising, the anime, things of that nature. Well, what if they just had another arc that didn't necessarily need a whole bunch of new Pokemon. Maybe bring in a few to tease the next generation as they've done in the past, but they have some sort of separate arc, or they extend the arc or season of what they're doing, and it would be fine. Take it, for example, one of the first generations of Pokemon where they did the Orange Islands. That's not a part of the mainline story, but people loved it. I did when I was a kid, and it was great. They can do stuff like that, and that could lead to alternative stories, and can also create its own level of merchandising and things of that nature, and Game Freak can still get the time they need to appropriately make quality games. Because they can make quality games, but when they're forced to come out with a game every year, or even more so than that, that's where things start to break down. So this is the solution, I think. Space things out a little bit more, rely on the Legend series, rely on more remasters and DLC, and be willing to have alternative storylines for the anime and the merchandising. That way there can be enough time for the next games to come out, because they are the source material. There needs to be quality here. It's not a proper representation of what a Nintendo game should be, and while right now things may be fine, and maybe unfortunately Pokemon Company may feel this way, so I hope not, but I'm hoping that these quality issues will be observed, and as opposed to waiting until things completely blow over and Pokemon Company starts to lose momentum because of this quality issue, they address this and they rectify it. But those are my thoughts on the issue. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.